Ready to level up your leadership? This is the Growth Project. Hi everyone, how are you? Welcome back to the Growth Project. Been a while, but I'm back. And today I'd like to talk to you about young workers. And the reason for this is I've been doing a lot of engaging with frontline leaders lately, and a very common theme that I'm hearing is a lot of frustration around people who lead young workers, particularly in hands-on occupations, civil, construction, utilities, and things like that. This is a very consistent theme that we hear about, I would say, at least multiple times a week. And this is something that I think needs some work in a lot of industries in Australia at the moment. And I think there's a balanced view. I'm going to try and give some balanced opinions on this, and I guess more food for thought, really. And hopefully some of that might resonate with you and give you some ideas about some things you might try if you're having frustrations like this. So let's talk about some of the issues and start, I guess, looking at the leader's perspective. We'll look at the other side of the fence as well, what the young worker's perspective might be, and then we'll try and balance this out and really see if there are some things to consider, especially from the leadership perspective, because I do think that the leader carries the onus here to improve these kinds of dynamics in the workplace. So let's start. Let's have a look at the leader's perspective. So I can tell you now the thing that I hear the most, these are the things that I hear the most when I ask people, what are the challenges that you're facing when leading young people? And the first one is always that they use their phone too much when they're supposed to be working. And I can see why that would be frustrating, especially if you're self-employed in a small business. But that doesn't even matter. If you're a crew leader or a supervisor or a team lead in a large company and you've still got deadlines to meet, you're trying to be productive, you're trying to get home at a reasonable time, that can be really frustrating to see. And that can be a source of conflict and tension. So that would be, without doubt, the number one. Number two, again, without doubt, closely behind the phone use would be attitude. So there's a perception that there's an attitude problem with a lot of young workers, and I guess tied up with work ethic as well. And common things like, the work ethic isn't what it used to be. If I carried myself through the workplace like this when I was younger, I'd had my butt kicked. All of those things I hear all of the time. And the other one that we often hear is that the young worker isn't very capable of receiving feedback, can't take hard feedback, and is too soft and things like that. So if I had to pick the top four things that I hear, those are the four things. And I try and take a balanced approach, and I also deal with a lot of young workers, apprentices, trainees, casual workers, you name it. And let me give you the balanced perspective. Let me tell you some of the things that they see as frustrating being in the workforce today. So one of the things we hear often is that they feel that their leaders are stuck in old ways of thinking and not open to new ideas, not open to new ways of doing things, and just think that the old school approach is going to work. And they often feel that, and there are actually studies that have verified this, and I believe the figure is about 40%. 40%. Let me just double check that. Actually, I had it written down here somewhere. Actually, it's higher than that. It's 70%. 70%, research found that 70% of young workers feel they don't receive enough mentoring and coaching to do their job effectively and to learn. That's a pretty big number. It's not necessarily saying that it's correct and true, but that's the perception of 70% of young workers. The other thing is let's look at some things to think about, food for thought. We know for a fact that young workers are more at risk of injury in the workplace. That is a proven fact that you cannot argue with, and there's lots of reasons for that. Pretty self-explanatory. They're inexperienced. They're not familiar with procedures. They're not familiar with how to use hand tools. They're not familiar with how to do certain tasks, how to use software programs. Maybe there's lots of different points of inexperience there. And so to some extent, they don't know what it is they're expected to do or the safe or correct or efficient way to do things, right? So that does put them in harm's way a little bit more. The other thing to keep in mind too is that younger workers, today's generation of young workers, do not value the same things when it comes to loyalty as what you or I might have in the past. So older generations typically would build their loyalty to their employer or their workplace based on where someone sits in or where they sit in the org chart, and I guess complying with expectations because of that. It might have been time served was a factor that that people built loyalty off. You know, how long they were offered gainful employment would be something they would value and build loyalty off. That isn't just not what the newer generation of workers build their loyalty from. We know for a fact that young workers today base their loyalty on things like what the dynamic is like in the workplace, what kind of environment it's like to be in. They value career opportunities, development opportunities. These are the things that they're valuing these days. So that causes a bit of a clash of values, right? And that's where we see a lot of this tension building. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that it's a very different world today. And yeah, we might complain. You might complain about the way it used to be and the way it is now. It's a moot point. There's no point in getting hung up on that. What we should be doing is just accepting that things have changed, and that's not the way it is anymore. And we have to adapt if we want things to go a little smoother, and if we don't want to experience as many of these issues. So, and I'm going to say something that some of you might think is controversial. It's not as easy being a young worker as you might think. Okay, there's been a lot of criticism about capability of young people these days. But what are you going to do about it? You've got to work with what you're working with, and if you think that people are coming in less capable than they used to be, then it's on you to build that up and put something in place to overcome that. Because how else is it going to get fixed? How else is it going to improve? So here's some other things to think about. I'm going to try and give some food for thought for leaders, because I do think that there is somewhat of a perspective shift that is required here. And I'm not saying that your concerns, your frustrations, your issues aren't valid, because it can be really frustrating dealing with these issues. I get it. I really do. And especially for small business, it can be a big problem. It can be crippling. But here are some things to think about. I would ask first, what work have you done on building rapport with your young workers? Because building trust, building up that relationship, if you want loyalty, if you want accountability, you want improvement, it's not coming without building up a relationship and building that rapport. So invest some time in building up that rapport with the young person. That's critical. That will pay dividends. It's not time wasted at all. The other thing I would ask is, how regularly are you giving feedback, and how effective do you think your feedback is in terms of the style of your delivery? So I've spoken a fair bit on this podcast about feedback, and in fact, I've done 1 or 2 episodes on feedback styles and techniques, and spoken about the SBI model. I'm a big fan of that one. I do also acknowledge that the feedback sandwich can be effective, but I think it's harder to execute, and I think it does have its flaws. But are we demonstrating enough integrity in offering regular feedback to young workers, or are we just expecting them to follow suit and not offering anything to help them get there? So I think that's worth thinking about. And if you think that might be something where you're lacking, just do some research on the SBI feedback model, and maybe go back and listen to some of those feedback episodes on this podcast, and search other podcasts. There's so much content out there about this. So, given also what I spoke about earlier in terms of what young workers build their loyalty from, what are you offering in terms of opportunities? And I guess also working conditions, right? So studies show that this is as big a factor for young workers choosing where they want to work or leaving an employer as is their salary. And studies are proving that consistently. So what are you offering your young workers? You might be thinking, well, I'm offering them employment and pay. Yeah, I get it. I do. And again, it just comes down to the fact that the reality of the situation is that that's not enough in terms of what they're going to base their loyalty off. That's the reality of the situation. And if we can't get on board with that, and you're in conflict with reality, I wouldn't expect much change. I wouldn't expect it to get much easier. So that's worth thinking about. And for a small business, that can come down to it could just maybe even come right down to your pricing. You know, if you're finding that you need to offer more, are you hamstrung based on your income and the fact that you can't afford to pay more to retain people, or for maybe some benefits that you want to use to attract and keep good young people? Maybe you need to look at pricing, and there's lots of resources and advice you could get on that. I'm not going to claim to be an expert in that space or even try and give any advice, but I think it's worth thinking about. So what is it that you're offering that's worth it? So it could simply be that you just offer a dynamic, fun workplace. Maybe that's all that needs to change. So you need to think about what it is that young people value, and attract them with something. That's how it works. All right. So there's those couple of things. How are you at handling difficult situations? So another thing that young workers base their loyalty from is comes down to the relationships in the workplace and what the environment's like. So when things are tense or when things don't go to plan, how do you conduct yourself? How do you have those conversations? Because I can tell you now, if you're not handling them well, you should expect a high turnover of staff, which is going to cost you a lot of money and heartache writing that out. And what I've seen often is people that just experience constant frustration in this area and cannot see the issues that they're probably causing for themselves, right? So you really got to be honest with yourself. How am I handling when things don't go to plan? Because you could be repelling people away from your business or your team because of that entirely. So if we think that the old school approach is the way it should work, if you think that the old school authoritative methods of handling poor performance and giving feedback and things like that, if you think that that's effective, then I'd reconsider. Okay, you might have a sentimental attachment to that. I don't get it personally, but what I do know is that it's been pretty well tried, tested and proven that it's not effective in this climate today. So it might get compliance in the short term, but that's only fear-based. And if someone falls into line because you've stamped down your authority, any improvement you're seeing is based on nothing more than fear. You're not seeing genuine growth and improvement for the right reasons. And that means that growth and you're not seeing genuine growth, and the improvement is not reliable. That is not reliable growth that you can depend on later. It's just not. The reality is, folks, we know way too much about psychology these days to justify this old school authoritative method of leading a team. You can't justify it anymore. We know too much, and we know what works and we know what doesn't work. So the challenge is then acknowledging that and making a commitment to boost up some skills, right? Because when it comes to young workers, we know that their brains are still developing, and I'm not saying that's a free pass. What I'm saying is we have to accept the reality of the situation. To take leadership in a situation and build up a capable young workforce, if we don't ditch that old school attitude and adapt, things either won't get easier ever, or if anything, they might get harder for you. So a bit of self-reflection here is needed. Now, I know it's always going into these sorts of discussions, it's hard to pick which way it's going to go. And I've probably, you might feel like I've gone more in the favor of the young worker. But when it comes to leadership, right, wrong, or indifferent, if you believe it's off center, or if it's you might be thinking that I'm wrong, that's cool. Let me know if you find a way to keep that old school approach and get the results with genuine growth and genuine improvement and not just compliance, right? If you can find a way, let us know. But leadership involves self-improvement. It involves self-reflection, and you can't argue with you can't argue with studies. You can't argue with proven facts. So my view is, let's get on board, folks. Let's get on board. And some of the key things that might help you get started in making some improvements in this space would be how to give feedback effectively, how to build trust, and how to handle difficult conversations. So those are some of the key things that I would focus on if I was having issues. But again, that's important. It's going to take time. But the first thing I would do would be to focus on building a rapport with the young people that you lead. That is going to give you a foundation to work from. You can build those skills all you like, but if you don't put the effort into that rapport, the skills won't matter. You'll be drawing blanks consistently. So start with the rapport. With the rapport, that will help build the trust. And when you start implementing some of those more evolved skills, communication skills, then that's where you'll start to see some of these issues going away or, becoming a little bit easier. Remember, we should be striving to create a workplace that you would be happy to send your kids to, right? And if we think that the old school method is the way to go, if we think that is the way to get genuine growth, I think you might feel differently if you think about your kids going into an environment like that. Okay? Create the workplace that you would be happy to send your child to. I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you on the next one. Stay safe, stay well, look after yourself and your teams. There you have it, folks. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of The Growth Project. I'm really enjoying the interaction, so please keep the messages and emails coming through. Keep an eye out for our upcoming Frontline Leader Mindset workshops at enlightening.com.au. They're in Sydney and Melbourne, and of course, you can reach out to request a private, customised workshop for your team. Again, that's enlightening.com.au. That's enlighterin.com.au. What would really help us send our leadership insights far and wide is 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or even just share the show with your network, family, and friends. Until the next episode, look after yourself and look after your teams.